All right, so like I said, continue on from last week. So a lot of this stuff I've been going over the last several days, and it's pretty deep. But I'm going to try to break it down. Um, try to break this down. Yeah, I'll tell you that here in a minute. We haven't got there yet, so I'm kind of building a framework here, groundwork, before we get there. And so we were talking about the day of the Lord. Remember, last week we kind of covered the catching away or the rapture, right? And so we talked about that. So the next fulfillment that goes regarding the day of the Lord, which then goes into the tribulation. Okay, so after the catching away or the rapture, then now you get into the tribulation, whenever that's going to be, after that. And so then it's the fulfillment of Daniel's 70th week. So we're going to be in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, and where it talks about this. All right. And the prophecy of the 70 weeks is complex and complicated. So we're going to try to break it down. And so if you got any questions, you need to stop me right in my tracks and talk. We need to talk about this because there's a lot of information regarding this. And like I said, I'm going to try to break it down as easy as possible. Because like I said, I went through this and I was wrecking my brain for the last couple of days trying to get all this information. And so I don't know, I don't expect you to get it in 1 hour. So if we have to go into it, continue on next week, then we can do that. But so we're going to be in Daniel chapter 9, starting in verse 29. All right, so it says, now while I was speaking, praying, and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God. Yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in a vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have come forth to give you skill to understand. Help us, Lord, to understand tonight. At the beginning of your supplications, the command went out. See, so that's another good thing for us. So take that at the word. At the beginning of your supplications, the command went out. And I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved, therefore consider the matter and understand the vision. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. He, even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate. All right, did you get that? Yeah, there's a lot there. And so we're going to be breaking this down. So one thing I want to point out is we see that the angel Gabriel appeared to Daniel, right? And revealed things that would take place in the future. Okay. And so in verse 24, Gabriel tells Daniel, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. So who's he really talking about? Okay, the children of Israel, really. Daniel, your people and the holy city, which is Jerusalem. Right. Okay. All right. So we see that he's talking a total, and then he says, there's going to be another week. In verse 26, says after the 62 weeks, we're going to talk about the 7 weeks and then the 62 weeks. And then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah is going to be cut off. All right. And then then there's going to be a prince who comes who will destroy the city. And then it's going to say he's going to make a covenant with many for 1 week. So there's another week. So actually you have the 7 weeks, the 62 weeks, and another week. Okay, everybody got that? It's 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and 1 week, which equals 70 weeks total. Okay, so we're going to be talking about that. But first, we're going to break down the week. So let's talk about the week. So 7 weeks are not 7-day weeks, like it's saying there. Okay, but 70 weeks of years. Okay, so each week represents 1 year. So when it said 70 weeks, or King James, it says 770 or 7 sevens, it actually equals 49 years. Okay, and then 62 weeks equals 438 or 34 years. Okay, and then the other week equals 7 years, which we're going to see that later, which is the tribulation period, right? 7 years. The tribulation is 7 years, right? 3.5, 3.5. It says, that talks about that, which we'll talk about later. In the middle of the week, that he's going to come in. That's where the Antichrist is going to come in the middle of the week and say, okay, you're not doing sacrifices no more. I'm God. You're going to worship me. You're God. So, all right. Oh, it's red. Yeah. I need batteries. So, all right. So we see the 7. So we see 70 weeks total. Okay. Everybody got that? And we can go look at that over. The word weeks in the Hebrew is Shabua. It refers to any period of 7 days, 7 months, 7 years, etc. So if we go over to Genesis 29, let's just go over there real quick. Chapter 29, I'm just going to give you an example. Genesis 29. Genesis 29. Everybody there? Good evening. Pizza, it looks like. All right. All right, Genesis 29, and let's look at 26 through 28. And Laban said, it must not be done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week. See that? And we will give you this one also for the service which you will serve with me still another 7 years. Okay, so we can stop right there. But so we see that he mentioned a week, but it actually represented 7 years. Okay, so there's other references in there pertaining to different times. But so a week doesn't necessarily mean a 7-day week. And in this case, based on other prophecies and time frames, it represents years. Okay, so it's for a total of 490 years. Okay, these 70 weeks equals 490 years, right? 70 times 7 is 490. Like we're supposed to forgive, right? 7 times 70. So anyway, so it's 490 years. So Gabriel was given Daniel a countdown or a clock that tells when the Messiah would come and other future events. Okay, everybody with me? Because it says it in there. All right, and so we're kind of now break this down. All right, but we do see within those 490 years, there's 6 things that must take place, which we read, right? One is to finish the transgression. Okay, and a transgression is a sin, right? Okay, to make an end of sins. Okay, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousnness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. All right. And since it's dealing with Israel, that really hasn't been fulfilled yet. Those haven't been fulfilled. So anyway, we're going to be talking about the 490 years, but we're going to break it down into the 3 sections of time. Okay. Which the first one is 7, right? 7 sevens. Okay. Verse 25 breaks it down into 2 sections where it says, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So 7 weeks times 7, 49 years. And then there's going to be 62 weeks, which is 62 times 7, right? It's going to be 434 years. Okay. And then, so when you add those 2 together, and you add that 7 years that are the one other week, you get 490 years total. Okay, everybody with me? Because this is, adding these numbers up is kind of confusing. But it's 1 week, which is, so just count 7 years or 49 years plus 434, right? 62 times 7, right?
Well, don't put that to the 3 times 3 times 3. You'll really be lost.
And then you have that 1 week, which is 7 years. So those 3 combined, 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and 1 week equals 70 weeks. So 70 times 7 is 490 years total. Okay, so that's really all you got to really worry about. Okay. So we're going to look at the 49 years, or which it says the 7 weeks. Okay. So those 2 together are 483 years. The reason I'm breaking this down is because this is important, because I wanted to know, what did the 7 mean? It says there are 7, he says there's 7 weeks, and then there's 62 weeks. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. So after the 62 weeks, it had to be after the 7, because he mentioned 7 first. So then you got the 62, which is a total of 69 weeks, right? So what was the reason for the 7? So I was racking my brain because I was looking at all these commentaries, things online, all these, scholars and everything else, and I couldn't really find anything. But then I did find something, and several of them had different. There's different viewpoints about this, and we'll kind of mention a few of them. But the first section of 49 years, the 7 weeks, deal with the rebuilding of the temple and repairing the walls of Jerusalem, based on decrees given by King Artaxerxes to both Ezra and Nehemiah, which Ezra and Nehemiah were close. They actually knew each other. And so King Artaxerxes told Ezra gave a decree that he can go build the temple. And Nehemiah was the one who repaired the walls. Remember that? The walls of Jerusalem were down. And so King Artaxerxes gave him a decree to go build the walls. And so that whole time, and the decrees were issued in the years 458 BC and 444 BC. Okay, that really doesn't mean anything as far as what you kind of have to remember, other than it does go in line with God's timetable, because it's amazing how this kind of works out. All right, so when we talk about the 49 years dealing with rebuilding of the temple, and those 7 years, which is 49 years, right? Those 7 weeks, which is 49 years, it brings us to the temple and Jerusalem, the temple being built and the repairing of the roads and everything and the walls of Jerusalem. So let's go over to John chapter 2, John chapter 2, verse 20. Okay, everybody there? John 2:20. So it says, then the Jews said, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days? So they were asking, so they mentioned that it took 46 years to build the temple. So when the decree went out to go build the temple, it took 46, 49 years. Okay, so that first 7 is dealing with that time frame. Okay, everybody with me? Yeah?
Yeah. That sounds, yeah.
Oh, I know, and we've never even talked about this, Daniel prophecy or anything. And so this is kind of all new, right? But it is important to know, especially the 1 week that it mentions after, which is the tribulation, goes into trib. But this part is also important because it leads up to Christ and his coming to earth. Okay. Some scholars believe that the end of this 49-year period also brought with it the end of Old Testament prophecy. Okay. Because the prophetic book of Nehemiah was written in this general time frame. The book of Nehemiah, which is interesting to know, did you know that the book of Nehemiah was the last book written, not Malachi? Okay. Nehemiah was the actual newest Old Testament book. Okay. Job, we know, is the oldest book in the Old Testament, and not Genesis. But and Nehemiah is the youngest book, and it was written from 424 to 400. So if you look back at the 458 or the 444 BC, and you add 49 years to that, that brings you right to the end of Nehemiah's book. Yes. 7. Yeah. 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Yeah. Well, it depends on when the prophecy was. There was one prophecy given 458, the other was given in 444. So that's a difference of 14 years right there. 2 different prophecies given. So you have a window right there that now covers that 46 to 49 years, right? And so, so the other prophecy is it basically is the end of the Old Testament books where Old Testament prophecy ended. Remember, then you had a 4-year span, 400-year span of nothing, right? Quiet. It was silence. 400 years of silence before Christ came. So if it ended, there, then you add, the 490 total years, it brings us to Christ, right? All right. So we know that the period between the prophecy in the Old Testament and the New Testament is often referred to as the intertestamental period, which doesn't mean anything. Okay. The 49-year would have concluded around 396 BC, with the beginning around 445 or 444 BC. All right. The 7 weeks of the years concluded in 396 BC, which is, I know this is brain racking, 49 years after the second decree of Artaxerxes in 444 BC. All right, you don't really need to worry about that. All right, so now that's the 7 years. So basically the 7 years or the 49 or 7 weeks or the 49 years went from the decree given out by King Artaxerxes to go build the temple and repair the walls of Jerusalem to both Ezra and Nehemiah, and it lasted to the end of the Old Testament, basically, which is the book of Nehemiah, which is around 400 BC. And then you have 400 BC, then you got the 400 years to 0 where Christ was born. Okay, so it ended, so that 49 years kind of ended right there. So that's pretty good timing, right? When you say, based on prophecy, given, command to go, a decree to go and build the temple, and then it ends right at the end of the Old Testament. Okay? Questions? How's your brains? Scrambled. Well, yeah, then that 400 years might be just a period or a parentheses where nothing has happened regarding the time frame. Okay, and so because there is a time frame within that. So when we look at 9:26, Daniel 9:26, it talks about now after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, right? So 62 weeks is 434 years, right? 62 times 7 years. So it's 434 years total. Okay. And yeah, that's it. Yeah. Yeah. The crucifix, because at the same time he entered in to Jerusalem the same week as, and they pronounced him the king, right? And they put the palm leaf down and said, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And that's kind of when they recognized him as the Messiah officially, right? And then that same week, which was the same year, he was crucified. So, so that could be said that they recognized him as a Messiah, and then he was crucified. So the prince, then that's when he officially became prince, as is saying in Scripture, that week. Even though he already is, but as far as the nation of Israel recognizing him, it was that week, the final week, they actually recognized him as the king and then crucified the king the same time. Right. Huh? What? The first 7. Yeah. The first 7 was basically the rebuilding of the temple and the walls that, led from the time of the decree to the end of the Old Testament. That's 49 years. So now we're just kind of, there's a gap or a parentheses between that. Okay. After the rebuilding of the temple and the walls of Jerusalem, 49 years, then there would be 434 years until Messiah is crucified. So that gap is part of that 400, because you had 49 years to the end of the Old Testament. Then you have 400 years, because now we're dealing with the 62 weeks, which is 434 years. So now you have 434 years from the end of the Old Testament until Christ, which is about right. So if you add 0 in there, which isn't counted, you got 433 years, which is 33. Okay, everybody got that? So there's a gap of 400 years between the Old and New Testament. That's 400. 62 weeks plus 7 weeks is 69 or 69 weeks, right? Which is, we said 483 total years. 483. So the time of the decree until Christ is 483 years. All right, but if you break that down, the 49 years goes to the Old Testament. So now we can kind of forget about the 49 years now. Now we're focused on the 62 weeks from the Old Testament until Christ. Okay, which is 434 years. Well, there was a 400-year gap between the Old and New Testament. Well, that wipes out 4 years. Now we're dealing with 34 years AD. If you put the 0 in there, because the 0 is not counted, well, or you cut that out, then you'd have to cut off the 4, make it 3. So now we got 33 years, okay? AD 33 until Messiah is cut off. AD 33. Okay. That would be confusing too.
Now I get it. I'm all over. A lot.
All right.
You weren't kidding.
All right. So that's the deal. So you got the 49 years, which was the 7 weeks. Okay, which it mentions 7 weeks. You had 49 years from the decree of building the temple and building the walls of Jerusalem by Ezra and Nehemiah. That concluded at the year 395 or somewhere around there. And the book of Nehemiah was written between some 450, 445 to 400. So right in there is the end of the Old Testament, because Nehemiah is the youngest book. Malachi is over here. Nehemiah is closest to the New Testament. Okay, so that's around 400 AD. Well, now there's a gap of 400 years. So that's the 7 weeks. That's the 49 years that happened between the decree and the building of the temple to the Old Testament. It took 46 years, they said, to build the temple. So we have that 49-year span there, the 7 weeks. Okay, so the 7 weeks is gone, right? So now we have the 62 weeks, which is 434 years. Okay, that's what we're trying to break this down into chunks. Okay, so we have the 62 weeks, which is 434 years. Well, between the Old and New Testament was how long? 400 years. Silence. Nothing happened. Okay, so now wipe that out. Take that out of your brain. Now, from 434 minus 400 is 34. Well, the 0 is not counted when you go from BC 1 to AD 1. Well, there's a 0 in there because it's like, there's a time frame. So you deduct that from the 34, gives you 33 AD. Okay? And it says in there, after the 62 weeks, which is that 434 years, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, for the people. Okay, so the Messiah is Jesus, right? So after the 434 years, he will be cut off. Okay? So this is the time frame that Gabriel was showing Daniel that the Messiah would be cut off. All right? And so, anyway, so this just shows how awesome God is with his timetable and accurate he is, right? Yeah, he's on time. That's right. Because God waited 400 years for Jesus to show up. Because he knew that he would only go 33 years of his lifespan. And so the 434 years is right there within the time frame. All right. Questions? No? All right. What? Yeah. So what's so great about using the 444 BC? So going back to 444 BC, when the decree was given by King Artaxerxes to Nehemiah to go build the walls or repair the walls. Okay. So this is a bunch of other numbers. Okay. So you don't really have to pay attention to this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Okay. Date is the fact that it uses a prophetic year of 360 days versus 365. So the Hebrew calendar is 360, okay, instead of the Gregorian calendar of 365. There are solid biblical reasons for looking at this prophecy from a prophetic year perspective as opposed to any other type of year. Okay, 483, which is the years total, is prophetic. It equals 173,880 days. Okay, so that's 360 days times 483 years comes up to that. All right, going forward in time to the year 0 is skipped. Like I said, brings from March 4th, 444. Okay, Nehemiah 2, 1 and 8. That's when the decree was given to him. 483 prophetic years would bring you out to March 30th, AD 33. Which could be easily the date that Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem found in Matthew 21. Then would be followed by his crucifixion on April 3rd or so around there, AD 33. All right? Everybody got that? But I wanted to break down the 3 time frames. Because when we go, we haven't even got into, which we're going to go into, which I didn't think we'd get done this quick. We're going to go into the week now where it says in verse 27, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. So we had the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks and then the 1 week. Okay, but there's a big gap between Christ's crucifixion, which is the end of the 62 weeks, right? Or the 69 weeks total, because there's a total of 70 weeks. So there's still 1 week left. which is a 7-year period, right? And that hasn't happened yet. Because clearly it says, he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, which we know that's what the Antichrist is going to do with Israel and other nations. We see what's going on over there now. There's going to be something's going to happen someday, maybe soon, that there's going to be a covenant made for peace. And then, the temple's going to be built, and then they're going to be allowed to do sacrifices in the temple, Israel. And then it says he's going in the middle of the week, 3.5 years. In Revelation, we see the 1260 days, 3.5 years that prince is going to bring an end to sacrifice and offering. So that's what we're going to be going to next. Okay, but we wanted to see, what's leading up to the tribulation. And we want to see prophecy. See how this was prophesied many years ago, right? Now, 2,500 years ago, this was prophesied. So what we're getting ready to come up to this last week, or these 7 years. Okay, so I just wanted to break this down that 7 weeks does mean something. It's the 49 years. That's when the decree went out to build the temple, and they did build the temple, right? And it was destroyed in 70 AD, right? So they built the temple. It took 46 years to build it, and of course, then the walls and everything else. So it took 49 years for all that to take place, and then to the end of the Old Testament. Then that's the 49 years. Then you have the 434 years. It goes from the end of the Old Testament to Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem and his crucifixion. Okay, so that's the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks. Now we're going to get ready to go into the 70th week. So that's really what the prophecy is about, the prophecy of the 70 weeks. So we just covered the 69 weeks, and then now we're going to get ready to go into the 70th week. That's where all chaos is going to happen. Right? Questions? That was a well, they say that there is a period. Well, there has to be a period in there because it says, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come, okay, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay, and then they could say that happened in AD 70, but actually it's still to come. The end of it shall be with the flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. So right now we're in desolations, right? And so then he shall confirm a covenant. So basically we're in another I don't want to call it silent, but we're in another silent or period of really, as far as prophecy goes, nothing happening until the 70th week. Just like we had the 400, even though that was counted in that time frame, but there's actually like a pause within this time frame from Messiah until the 70th week starts. Yeah, 20. Yeah. Yes.
So would it be considered that we're in the 69th week now?
Yeah, it's part of it. Yeah, it's part of that 69th week. But really, if you look at some people say that, but if you look at when it actually ended, Messiah being cut off, that would have been the end of the 69th week. So, but there's just actually a comma or a period or a pause between that period and the 70th week. So we know that, not everything is like exactly like time frame God. God is, waiting, or he does things. Of course, his ways are higher than our ways and everything else. So sometimes we don't understand why is there just long gap in here, right? But we know the prophecy came about and it's being fulfilled. And so the next thing that take place is going to be the 70th week, because the 69 weeks have occurred, but the final is not yet, because all those things listed that we talked about still have to take place to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity. And some people say that Jesus did that on the cross, but they're not complete. to bring it in everlasting righteousness. Of course, that hasn't happened yet, right? Until the judgment day, right? To seal up the vision and prophecy, which will be done, and to anoint the most holy, which the New Jerusalem comes down and stuff like that, right? So that stuff really hasn't been completed. So this prophecy is not completely fulfilled. Plus, we see the prince who is to come is going to make a covenant, and in the middle of the week, which is the middle of 7 years, he's going to basically desecrate the temple and do some things, which we're going to talk about later. So that's still that 1 week, that 7-year period is still to come. So, yeah.
Possibly, it's not a gap. Possibly, there's a purpose, there's a prophecy that Daniel promoted or said in his book, and then it brings us to Christ. And then,
which could be an extension.
yeah, but it couldn't, not necessarily was supposed to be complete. I mean, he wasn't necessarily. Really
Well, and that's true, because that's one of the things, right? That it says to seal up the vision and prophecy, and that hasn't been done yet, because that vision and that prophecy is not complete. Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's kind of how it all, ties together. That's the good thing about like the Bible with the puzzle pieces and stuff. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then it also resonates to the fact that it's church history. I mean, there are 7 parts to complete church, from beginning after Christ to the
Right. Comes back.
going down.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing. There could be there's a lot of reasons behind that, and so even though that it looks like the 69 weeks have ended with Christ being crucified, and now we have another gap or whatever, but with everything, all the other connections or the pieces within the Bible that have this period of God now ministering when he was cut off. That's actually, it started, to the disciples to go out to all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? Until he comes back. So you're right. That's like an extension of the prophecy. So,
This is not my take on it. Some theologians say that some places in the Bible, in Revelation, they talk about consciousness as part of the equation, and he was back in 400 or whatever AD.
right. Well, also talks about, I think, Epiphanes, who was the one that slaughtered the pig inside the temple, the first temple, and did that. So there's several people throughout history that they thought fit this prince to come. But really, there hasn't been one where in the middle of the week or the middle of 7 years that he's, basically said, enough sacrificing, you're going to worship me, I'm God, and break the covenant, right? And so we're going to see that in Revelation. So that's kind of, I think, where we're going next week. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so, yeah. And so, so that's kind of where we're at. And so this long span, 2,500 years, or we got 400 years from the Old Testament, or from Christ, at least from Christ, 2,000 years. That's the other timetable. Is about every 2,000 years, something happens within history. We got about 2,000 year mark. Adam and Eve, 2,000 year mark or so. The flood took place. 2,000 years from there or so, Jesus came, and now we're at a 2,000 year point where he says he's coming back. And so we're in that window of the 6,000 years, and then we have the millennium, which is 1,000-year reign, right? When that takes place on the earth, well, the 6 plus the 1 is 7, which is completion. And after the 7,000 year, then we have the judgment and the New Jerusalem, the new heavens, and new earth, and everything's made new. So that's, perfection, completion at the end of 7,000 years. And so we see about every 2,000 years, something drastic has taken place upon the earth, regarding God, right? So we're at, yeah,
So the 7 is actually 49 years, right?
yes.
So we could be a part of the 49 years right now.
Well, that 7 was
We
the
don't
first,
know.
oh, you're talking about this, last 1 week, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah,
Or are
this
you talking like a
7 years, 7 years.
Okay.
No, and we're probably not in the 70th week, which is 7 years. It's only 1 week. Remember, 1 week equals 1 year, or 7 years, I mean. 1 week equals 7 years. So we're not there yet,
Okay.
because that's a tribulation. And we're gonna see that, you know, we're not in that. We're not there, because there's a lot of stuff going on there, and the church is never mentioned within the tribulation time frame. And so but we're gonna cover all that. So there's a lot to this. Anybody got any questions? Any other questions, comments?
Talk about the dead time zones or whatever you want. Periods of time. I always think of 2 Peter 3:8, where it talks about 1,000 years as a day.
Yeah, I thought about that earlier. Yeah, to God, 1,000 years as a day, and a day as 1,000 years. So yeah, with God, this time frame is really nothing. You know, it's in the span of eternity. It's nothing. It's no time at all. And so God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. So he's not, of course, he's not slack concerning his promise, where he's coming back, but he's also long suffering, willing that, all giving everybody the opportunity to come to this, salvation through his son, Jesus Christ. And so, anyway, there's a time frame, and when we look at history, the 7,000 years, which is perfection, 7 is completion. Well, we're somewhere around the 2,000 year mark from Christ. Whether it would probably be his crucifixion, and we're coming up on that. If it was AD 33, we're 9 years away from the 2,000 year mark. So we're right within that window. And there's never been a time where Israel became a nation like it prophesied. And we're at 75 years for that. When you talk about a generation, it's between 70 and 100, right? He told Abraham, your children, your descendants would be slaves for 4 generations. They were there for 400 years, right? So that's a generation, is 100 years. And then he talks about in the Bible that man will live to be 70, possibly 80 years. So there you got from 70 to 100 years as a possible generation, right? And so Israel's been a nation for 75 years now. So everything's kind of coming to a head. We're almost at the 2,000 year mark. Israel, the last prophecy fulfilled, Israel became a nation in 1948 for 75 years. So there's a lot of stuff coming on. We see the perilous times where, the falling away, right? Many will turn from the faith. There'll be lovers of themselves versus lovers of God. All this stuff we see is taking place around the world. It's just craziness going on, right? So everything's coming to a head. And so, we're not far off from the return of Christ and the tribulation. And, that could be another 10 years. That could be another, who knows? But it's coming. He said it. So he's coming back. And so, when you start adding up this, nobody knows the day or the hour, but, he tells us to look, there's seasons and stuff. We can look at what's going on in America. We've never been this dysfunctional, before, where people can't even figure out certain pronouns and define who, people are. Craziness going on. And that's this, the enemy knows his time short, tells us that he's speeding things up. He's in a hurry to try to turn as many people away from God as possible. And we see that happening, right? So, all right. Anything else? Anybody else got anything? All right.
Never understood the week. I never understood that. That's good.
Yeah.
It took 3 times or 4 times to explain it. But
Well, it took me about 2 or 3 days. try to figure this out. All you gotta know is we're going into the tribulation pretty soon. Then we're gonna be talking about that. That's the main thing. All right. Anybody else? Got anything? No? All right.
Hey, Russ.
Please be back Sunday. Yeah. Hot Dogs Friday, celebrate recovery.
I gotta tell you, about halfway through that thing, I couldn't stop thinking about, that would have made a great episode of Abbott and Costello. You know, like who's on first and 62 and 7 and 9 and 49. Would have been good.
Yeah. Hey, we have all their movies on DVD.
Think about it.
All right, but anybody have any questions? You confused about something? Just know that there's a 49 years, which is the 7 weeks, right? That came to the Old Testament. But from the decree to build the temple, which took 46 years, the decree was given. And from that time to the Old Testament, when everything was accomplished, that covered that prophecy. And then from the Old Testament until Christ was crucified, 434 years, covered that prophecy, that time frame, right? The 62 weeks, 434 years, right? Now we still have the 1 week or the 7-year period, which is the 70th week. That covered 69 weeks. Now we have the 1 week, which is the 70th week that we need to go over. Okay, which is actually starting of the tribulation in Revelation. So that's pretty much how you would break it down, those 3 periods. All right. Okay, all right, let's pray.